Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. This morning, our committee tabled a report on systemic racism in policing. Our committee began the study almost a year ago, and today we'll share some of the findings. As Vice Chief Terry Teague from British Columbia Assembly of First Nations explained to the committee, and I'm quoting, "In my language, we call the RCMP Nilchukun, which interpreted in our language is those who take us away. The relationship between police officers and the people they serve is fundamentally about trust. This report tries to offer solutions to rebuild trust and advocate for stronger mechanisms to ensure accountability for officers when they violate that trust. The RCMP must have more effective civilian oversight body. To achieve this, we must properly resource and empower the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP, also known as the CRCC, to better hold the RCMP to account. Professor Kent Roach noted that the CRCC is underfunded and underpowered. This is the lack of trust in the CRCC, which is further compounded by the time it takes the RCMP to respond, and the fact that there is no requirement for the RCMP to implement the recommendations of the CRCC. One of the report's recommendations included creating a statutory timeline for responses by the RCMP Commissioner to the CRCC. Dr. Alan Benson, Chief Executive Officer of Native Counselling Services of Alberta, explained the CRCC needs the power to impose sanctions or consequences. Recommendations in this report state that the Commissioner must be legally required to provide a written response indicating actions have been taken concerning the complaint, and if no action is taken, the reasons why. We also know the CRCC needs to be made more accessible to those who may want to file a complaint. The chairperson of the CRCC herself referred to the process of filing a complaint as, quote, excessively bureaucratic and difficult to navigate. According to Dr. Benson, this makes the complaint process, quote, consequently inaccessible for those who might otherwise file. We agree with the chairperson's assessment and want to see the CRCC become a more diverse organization. Chairperson Leahy suggested that consultations with Indigenous peoples and racialized communities will help identify and break down systemic barriers. By properly empowering the CRCC, faith can be restored in the ability to hold the RCMP to account. We've also made recommendations to make First Nations policing an essential service. Many witnesses articulated the need for Indigenous police services to be made essential services and the need for an Indigenous policing framework to be established in order to ensure these services are provided. They must have long-term stable funding. We also were cautioned that unless a change to essential service status also includes sufficient financial resources, First Nations policing would not be a success. The committee fully supports designating Indigenous police services as an essential service and stresses the importance that this designation be in conjunction with an increase in spending to ensure that these services are adequately resourced. I'm going to turn now to our chair of our committee, John McKay.
Thank you, Pam, and I appreciate the opportunity to offer a few observations to what I consider to be a very significant report into one of Canada's premier institutions. I tabled this morning, the report was titled Report on Systemic Racism in Policing, and largely focused on the RCMP. Indeed, the Mounties are associated with Canada around the world, and the world associates Canada with the Mounties. However, there is a season and a time for a reckoning for every country and its institutions. This, in my judgment, is a time for Canada to have a reckoning with itself and with its premier institutions. The RCMP was founded as a quasi-military institution, and in some respects has never left that mandate. Canadians, however, are looking for something different, a police service, and therein lies a significant difference. I commend to all those who are reading the report recommendations number 8 and 9 which encourages the transition from a quasi-military institution to a police service with civilian oversight. Recommendations 1 to 7 deal with the dysfunctional relationship between the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, CRCC, and the RCMP. Pam was understated in her comments about the dysfunctionality of this relationship. The commissioner for the CRC these requests were not handled in a timely fashion. If they were handled at all, they were handled in an unsatisfactory manner. And frequently, any requests or recommendations were left to die. This has to stop. And as chair of the committee, I was struck by the forcefulness of the commissioner for the CRCC and her dissatisfaction with the RCMP. So my colleagues will talk about, no doubt, other elements of the recommendations, all of which I think the committee worked hard on. And I want to recognize the hard work of everyone on the committee. There was a minimum of partisanship and rancor. This committee did what it was supposed to do. It took in evidence, it took in reports, and then produced, after a lot of hard work, the report that you see before you today. So may I recommend to you that report, and hopefully this will constitute a path forward to address the racism in policing in Canada. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, John. Ça m'a fait un grand plaisir de vous joindre aujourd'hui pour parler de deux recommandations en particulier de ce rapport du comité. Tout d'abord, les recommandations 41 et 42 qui s'agit de la question de l'importance des données désagrégées. If we are going to fight and combat systemic racism that exists in institutions such as the RCMP, you have to make sure that you're collecting the data necessary to measure where you are. You just simply can't change what you can't measure. And so I'd like to compliment the members of the Public Security Committee, under the chairmanship of Mr. McKay, and all the members who worked very hard to making sure that they heard from witnesses who were particularly concerned about how to ensure that the path forward will lead to less systemic discrimination, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous policing that could exist, that does exist in our system. You know, we know that our justice and public security institutions have marginalized Indigenous peoples, Black and racialized people in Canada. The overcriminalization of people of color perpetuates systemic racism and leads to worsening outcomes. We must actively seek better ways to move forward. Our government is committed to building a more inclusive Canada, which means we must seek more effective ways to shape policing. Et si je peux juste citer les deux recommandations qui étaient dans le rapport, qui étaient vraiment importantes, c'est que le gouvernement du Canada s'assure qu'une analyse raciale critique soit appliquée à toutes les données policières désagrégées, fondées sur la race, recueillies afin d'éviter que la façon dont elles sont utilisées plutôt, stigmatisent et marginalisent davantage les personnes racialisées et les autochtones. Ça, c'est une recommandation clé. Et deuxièmement, c'est que le gouvernement du Canada oblige la Gendarmerie royale du Canada à recueillir et à publier les données nationales complètes et désagrégées sur la race, couvrant les interactions de la police avec le public. Je peux vous dire que je suis fier que le gouvernement a déjà entamé du travail dans cette direction. Il faut qu'on continue. Les recommandations de ce rapport vont s'assurer que le Parlement canadien va continuer dans cette même ligne d'action qui est important si on veut vraiment éliminer le racisme avec nos forces policières. Merci. Maintenant, j'aimerais céder la parole à ma collègue de Saint-Laurent, Cartierville, Emmanuela Lambropoulos.
Merci, Greg. Ce n'est plus Cartierville, c'est juste Saint-Laurent. Ce rapport est extrêmement important. Et puis, comme on le sait, la police agit en tant que gardien du système de justice pénale et son exercice de discrétion détermine en partie quel comportement sera soumis à la criminalisation. Du moment où les agents exercent leur pouvoir de manière raciste, les décisions qui en découlent vont contribuer aux disparités et à la surreprésentation des personnes racialisées et des Premières Nations dans les instances de la justice pénale. Ces groupes d'individus ont des taux d'incarcération plus élevés. De l'avis d'un témoin, les personnes racisées et les Autochtones font l'objet d'une attaque policière, de l'harcèlement et d'un nombre disproportionné de décisions de culpabilité assorties de lourdes peines. De même qu'ils sont sujets à des traitements hors normes dans des instances correctionnelles. Et d'autres ont témoigné qu'il serait important que les services de police soient représentatifs des populations qu'ils desservent et soient un reflet de celles-ci par la diversité. La collecte de données, comme a parlé mon collègue Greg, c'est extrêmement important car c'est comme ça que nous allons pouvoir trouver des solutions aux problèmes qui existent par rapport à ça. Et nous avons aussi trouvé que la culture de la GRC doit changer. Donc, la GRC, présentement, l'entraînement est un petit peu comme paramilitaire et ça doit changer, ça doit devenir plus professionnel. Et aussi, les gens doivent faire l'entraînement dans les communautés où ils vont servir pour vraiment bien connaître les gens qu'ils vont servir et pour qu'ils puissent faire un bon travail. Donc, c'est ça. Ensuite, de plus, l'Assemblée des Premières Nations a suggéré aussi de former les agents de la GRC localement, et ce, dans l'intérêt de ceux qu'ils servent. De plus, il serait pertinent de mettre aussi en place un collège national de police pour assurer une formation spécialisée, professionnelle et fondée sur des données probantes semblables au modèle employé au Royaume-Uni. L'objectif est de fournir à ceux qui travaillent dans les services de police les compétences, les connaissances et les habiletés nécessaires pour prévenir la criminalité, protéger les citoyens et assurer la confiance du public. Donc, je vais passer la parole à Kamal.
Merci, Emanuela. Good morning, everyone. A little over a year ago, death of George Floyd shook the entire world. Knowing full well that Canada is not immune to racism, and after learning the horrifying incidents involving the RCMP and the Indigenous people, my colleagues and I on committee set out to better understand the presence of systemic racism in policing in Canada and the impact it has on Indigenous, Black, and racialized Canadians. I've seen this impact close up in my own community of Brampton, where DeAndre Campbell, a young Black man, and Ijaz Chaudhry, an elderly Muslim Canadian, represent just two of the many stories of people who were taken from their families and communities far too soon. Their deaths were avoidable and serve as a constant reminder of the work that remains. One of the things that we heard throughout this study and was identified as a major challenge for police services was the increasingly number of police interactions in responding to crises related to mental health or wellness checks. The committee heard extensively on the need to have concrete, culturally specific mental health, addiction, and social service support to respond to the crisis or to prevent them altogether. This report makes significant recommendations to the Government of Canada on this to work with provinces and territories, municipalities, Indigenous and racialized communities to ensure adequate funding and service responsibilities related to mental health and victim services. and to encourage the use of personnel specialized in victim services, mental health, who would be available with first responders in situations requiring de-escalation that are tailored to address the needs of the specific communities. Our committee also heard from Peel Regional Police Chief Nish, who has set out to make bold and meaningful changes, shifting from traditional law enforcement methods to a pro-public health model, which is rooted in human rights. By teaming up with Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Canadian Mental Health Association, Peel Regional Police is moving in the right direction in showcasing how policing can be done differently in addressing systemic racism. The report highlights and addresses the pervasive nature of racism in policing at its roots. And as a member of Parliament, representing the largest Black community in Canada, I look forward to continuing to work with all parties involved so that we can continue to construct a Canada in which all Canadians, regardless of their race, identity, feel safe at their homes, in their communities. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to MP Fisher.
Well, thank you very much, Kamal, and good morning, everyone from beautiful Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I want to take a quick second. I'm the newest member of this committee, and I wanted to take a moment to thank my colleagues, the colleagues who spoke before me today that did the heavy lifting, the mammoth work to get this report across the finish line. So thank you very much to those folks who spoke before me. Look, it's no secret that Canada's institutions, most of which were born from colonialism, were designed with the cards stacked against Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. We know that this systemic racism continues to persist in these institutions. It continues to persist within the justice system and in police departments right across the country. We know that the government has been paying very close attention to this study, and as our government continues to work towards a more inclusive country, we have to ensure that transforming these institutions is at the forefront of that work. The recommendations in this report are meant to be helpful, not only for our government, but for all orders of government and police departments across the country. It's important that all orders of government step up and tackle this issue within their respective jurisdictions. I thank you very much for attending today, and I will pass it over to Pam to wrap up.
Thank you. There were 42 recommendations in the report. We have not been able to go through all of them in the limited time. There's training, recommendations around training, increased diversity, and the importance of consultation with Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and people of color. We hope that this report will serve as a roadmap and a pathway forward for not only the RCMP, but policing services across the country. We feel that a focus needs to be put just as much on human rights as it is on the criminal code, and we're pleased to see that the government has been following our work. We heard from 53 witnesses, we've received 21 briefs, and we'll be pleased to take questions now if anyone has any.
And we'll go to the phone for questions. A reminder to reporter, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons au téléphone pour des questions. Je rappelle aux journalistes une question de suivi. Opératrice, avons-nous une première question?
Thank you. We have a question from Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Hi, yes, good morning. Mr. McKay, you talked about being struck by the forcefulness of the chair of the CRCC, and I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you would like to see. I've seen some of the recommendations, but it seems like one of the biggest issues is that the CRCC recommendations just aren't being implemented whatsoever. I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yes, I've been, as you know, been around the Hill for quite a number of years, sat on quite a number of committees, and it's seldom been my experience that commissioners are anything other than fairly nuanced in their testimony. This was not nuanced testimony. Commissioner, in her frustrations with the responses or non-responses of the RCMP, and I direct your attention to recommendation number 1, that the Government of Canada clarify and strengthen the mandate and independence and efficacy of the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP. I would say that the committee members were, to a man or a woman, struck by the forcefulness with which Commissioner Leahy laid out her frustrations with the RCMP, and it was not in the least subtle. And so you'll take note that the first 7 recommendations deal with the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, and I would dare say, and that might be job 1 for the government to, and I think that should be a very high priority for the RCMP to respond in a timely fashion to complaints that are submitted through the CRCC.
Thank you. And I'm also wondering.
Sorry, could I add something to that?
Sure.
I was just going to say, you don't have to look too far to just see an example of that with the Colton Bushy's family, where 2 complaints were being reviewed by the CRCC, and it took far too long for the report to be released by the CRCC, and that was because the RCMP had it in their possession and had not passed it on. So I don't think families should have to wait that long, and I think we all feel that any recommendations that are made must be implemented.
Thank you. Can I just ask that when you take to the mic that you identify yourself, because those of us not watching on television see,
I'm
so we
sorry.
don't necessarily know who's
I'm
speaking.
sorry. That was Pam Demoff speaking.
Okay, thank you. I'm just also wondering, when this study began last spring, there was some criticism that it was just another stalling tactic, that we knew what the problems were. We know that systemic racism is a problem in policing, and that we weren't going to identify anything new with this study. Just wondering if a year later, anyone on the committee feels that nothing new was uncovered, or if this really was a beneficial exercise.
It's Pam Demoff speaking again. I think what was known throughout the country was that systemic racism exists, and particularly by those who have come in contact with police services across the country. I think the study that we did was valuable to be able to bring people into one place. As I mentioned, we heard from 53 witnesses, give them a voice for the changes that are needed. And as John has so eloquently stated, that starts with some kind of accountability for the RCMP. Dr. Alan Benson put it very well, that there needs to be accountability, but also, very importantly, there needs to be consequences when people are not behaving as they should when they're doing their job.
And so
And may I, as Sean McKay again, may I just add to Pam's comments by saying that it's one thing for members of parliament to have, if you will, an informed newspaper understanding of the issues, even an experiential understanding of the issues. The benefit of a parliamentary committee properly functioning, and in this case it was, is that it can go in depth into the specific issues. And so I, for one, was not aware of the depth of the issues with the CRCC. I, for one, was not aware of the dysfunctionality of the training that goes on for the RCMP. And so, so it was more than a useful exercise. It was an absolutely necessary exercise. And if we are to pursue a path that is to improve policing in Canada, we need to have committees such as this review the evidence and recommend to the government and to the commissioner, this is the path forward, and we want you to take it. We represent the people of Canada. Take this path, and you can't do that unless you put the hard work in of doing well, really a year's study on this particular issue.
If I could add in a comment on this, Greg Fergus here. Ms. Rabson, you're right. The shortcomings of our police services have been known to Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, racialized peoples, and I'd even argue many women's groups. That is not new. But what is new is precisely what John had just pointed out. And what's also new is that there's a roadmap now, because of this report, this unanimous report of parliamentarians from all walks of life, have laid out a very clear process forward to make the changes not only in the RCMP, but in police services across the country, which can be inspired by this. That's what's new, that's what's important, that's what's necessary if we're actually going to make the changes that equity-seeking groups have long identified, but need to be supported by committees such as the Public Security Committee.
So we have about 3 minutes left for a last question. 3 minutes restantes pour une dernière question au téléphone, s'il y en a une, opératrice.
Thank you. Merci. The next question is from Tom Korski from Blacklock's Reporter. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Okay, 3 minutes. I'll make it short. John McKay, you said last year, I'm quoting, in the United States, possibly even other police forces here in Canada, the unions have frequently been a huge problem, particularly protecting officers who by any other circumstances should have been let go, unquote. Report doesn't use the phrase police unions. Can you comment?
I think I would stand by that comment, particularly with respect to the Minneapolis issue, and because the officer in question was literally protected by his union and had a number of complaints about him that the mayor and the police commission felt they couldn't do anything about. There is an anticipated union to come to the RCMP, which as a bargaining agent, I think is a good thing. I would be, and this report did not deal with that, may I say, but as a bargaining agent, I think that's quite useful as an agency to protect officers from consequences of malfeasance. That is, I sincerely hope that is not a path that the union and the RCMP go down. And I think as I say, the report did not directly address that issue, but there are elements in the report which call for more accountability, more transparency, more training, and a whole variety of things that hopefully will militate against the very issues that we see in the United States on a regular basis.
And my follow-up, Mr. McKay, I'll speak very quickly. Senator Bussin, former RCMP commissioner, during the Black Lives Matter protests attended by the Prime Minister, said, I'm quoting her, she said, disturbingly, I see a tendency by some to stereotype equally each and every police officer with the same criminal motives. I'm referring to the wave of hatred and disrespect directed at our police forces. Generally, police are people. They are mothers and fathers. To that point, we see through access to information, not your committee, a 2017 briefing note to Ralph Goodale, 36% of suspects shot dead by the Mounties over a 10-year period were Indigenous. Even the Mounties called it, I'm quoting, disproportionately high. The majority of those suspects who were killed in police custody were not carrying firearms. Your committee did not name names. It did not look at this memo. It did not summon Goodale. Aren't parliamentary committees famous for that? You talk about culture or systemic change. Why not name names just once to avoid what Senator Bussin is referring to, these sort of blanket statements about all police are systemic racists? Why not name names just once?
Well, first of all, the evidence is the evidence that we heard, and it was quite extensive. Second of all, we're not here to cast blame, particularly on individual police officers. That is probably beyond the purview of the committee and the parameters of the study. So, and thirdly, I don't know that actually advances the file. We are concerned about the overall systemic issues that permeate through the RCMP and other policing services. Hence, I appreciate that there might be some interest in trying to name names, but I don't think that actually does what we as a committee wanted to do, which is study the overall systemic aspects of this of policing in Canada.
It's Pam Demoff. Just very quickly, I think you're missing the forest for the trees if you're focusing on individual officers. There's nothing in this report that says there's systemic racists. It says that the institution themselves have systemic racism, and that's the focus of our study, not on individuals. Thank you.
And this concludes the press conference. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.